is enough. I wanted to flag this article. Just all you have to do is look at the headline. Basically, the gentleman there is the whistleblower. They're saying if any of them talk, they will fire them.
Everybody start?
Yes.
Thank you.
I want to flag that. If you just look at the headline.
Good afternoon, everyone. Is this on? Is the mic on? Hello? It is on, right? Yes, okay. This hearing for the Subcommittee on Africa, Global Health, Global Human Rights, and International Organizations will come to order. The subcommittee is meeting today to hear testimony on the humanitarian aspects of the migratory crisis on the U.S. southern border. Without objection, all members may have 5 days to submit statements, questions, and other materials for the record, subject to the length limitations in the rules. I recognize myself for the purpose of making an opening statement, and I would like to thank our witnesses for being with us here today. I have wanted to hold this hearing for some time, mostly because I think it is important to consider the crisis on the U.S. southern border from an international humanitarian perspective. In my role in the subcommittee, I've traveled to many African countries. I have visited refugee camps in Uganda, Rwanda, and South Sudan. I have watched the flow of migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers rise and fall based on what's happening in their own countries. This is a global phenomenon. When insecurity increases, and by that I mean increasing violence, political tensions, or climate issues like droughts or floods, then we see populations move. People are seeking safety. What usually happens is that people cross borders into neighboring countries. That's where we see countries like Uganda take in sometimes hundreds of thousands of people. Other countries like Cameroon, that is facing its own internal crisis, continues to take in refugees from neighboring countries, and a country like Niger, which ranked 189 out of 189 on the 2018 Human Development Index, took in thousands of displaced persons who were in real danger and facing serious human rights abuses in detention camps in Libya. This really made me stop and ask, well, what's going on here? How is it that some of the poorest nations around the world can take in peoples in crises? What can we learn from these countries? How do international organizations like UNHCR, that is the UN High Commission for Refugees, and the International Committee of the Red Cross, the International Organization for Migration, and others, monitor and advise on the surge in migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers? What are the international protocols, norms, and standards, and practices that should be followed? Basically, I want to know what can we learn from other countries around the world, but mostly I want to understand where the U.S. is in regard to these practices, norms, and standards. And if we are falling short, and I know we are, make no mistake, when I look at what is happening within our own country, I know we are falling short. Like I said, I visited numerous refugee camps, and I have never seen families ripped apart. And when I look at how we are dealing with neighboring countries, I know we are falling short. If in comparison to the rest of the world we're falling short, then we need to find those spaces where Congress can help to hold the administration accountable. We need to find those places where we can strengthen and improve how we do things. We need to make sure that the actions of the United States are not placing these populations at further risk. I'm particularly concerned about the U.S. migrant protection protocols, known to most as the Remain in Mexico policy. This is the policy where U.S. returns non-Mexican immigrants who are in immigration court proceedings in Mexico to await their immigration court decisions. There are also agreements with other nations to ban, block, or deter asylum seekers from continuing on to seek asylum. The State Department's 2019 Trafficking in Person reports documents how migrants in Mexico are vulnerable to human rights abuses and human trafficking, including sex trafficking. There are also reports of criminal gangs and cartels in numerous countries preying on people. I know we've all seen large caravans on the news, but what many don't realize is that these people are traveling like that for protection. Rather than a law enforcement approach, which is what our policy has been so far, where people are criminalized and end up in detention in private prisons, I might ask, What we need is a humanitarian approach to the migratory crisis at the U.S. southern border, and that's why we're here today. Because the subcommittee also has a regional focus on Africa, I want to highlight that there are increasing numbers of Africans on our southern border seeking asylum in the U.S. Many are coming from Cameroon, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, as well as other countries. They have been forced to flee their countries because of serious insecurity. Today, the Democratic Republic of the Congo is one of the most complex and challenging humanitarian situations worldwide, with multiple conflicts affecting several parts of its vast territory. In Cameroon, there is conflict in the northwest and southwest Anglophone region. Many are seeking asylum because Cameroon's Anglophone regions are in the middle of a deadly cycle of violence. Security forces and armed groups are killing and displacing innocent civilians, forcing young children to leave school, and many have been out of school for years. There are numerous root causes for why people are forced to leave their countries, and this is why it's critical for the United States to continue to fund the USAID. Isn't it better to address the root causes of why people leave their countries to begin with? Once people have been forced to leave, they require a host of protections. During the journey, displaced people are especially vulnerable to horrific abuses, including enduring forced labor and being held in detention camps. We want to have this hearing today to understand what we're facing on our borders and understand international best practices in dealing with displaced persons. We are at a moment when countries are cracking down, but I believe that the United States can find a balance and bring leadership to these issues. With that, I would like to introduce the witnesses today. Charanya Krishnaswami, close? Okay.
Yeah.
Is an advocacy director for the Americas at Amnesty International USA, where she directs the organization's U.S.-facing policy advocacy related to human rights in the Americas, with a focus on the Mexico-U.S. border issues and access to asylum. Previously, she worked with UNHCR, where she managed some of the agency's refugee status determination worked to facilitate refugees' access to economic and social rights. Our next witness is Douglas Stevens. He is an attorney who has the bar in California, who joined the Center for Immigration, Legal, and Support Services at Catholic Charities in San Francisco as a supervising attorney. Before entering the private bar, Douglas worked for 4 years as a civil servant in the federal government. He served as an asylum officer for 2 years in USCIS San Francisco Asylum Office from 2017 until 2019. At the asylum office, he conducted and adjudicated over 350 affirmative asylum, credible fear, or reasonable fear interviews with applicants originating from approximately 40 countries. Kate Clark is a senior director of immigration services and lead immigration attorney at the Jewish Family Service Center in San Diego. In these roles, she advocates on behalf of San Diego's refugees and asylum seekers and assists the immigrant community at large in applying for various immigration benefits. Nana Gyamfi is the executive director of the Black Alliance for Just Immigration, the largest Black-led social justice organization representing the nearly 10 million Black immigrants, refugees, and families living in the United States. She previously served as BAJI, Black Alliance for Just Immigration's vice chair and managing director. I would like to invite our witnesses. Okay. Oh, okay. Actually, before I ask the witnesses to speak, let me ask Representative Juan Vargas to share a few words with us. We are fortunate that he was willing to host us. We are in his district today, and we are very proud to be here, and we have told him that we're here today and we're going to come back.
And again, good afternoon. I want to welcome everyone here. It is with great pleasure that I welcome the Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Africa, Global Health, Global Human Rights, and International Organizations to my district. And as Madam Chair has said, she's here, but she'll come again. And the truth of the matter, Karen and I have been friends for a long time, and she always keeps her word. I know that she's going to be back, and I think it's very, very important. I won't be long, but I am very pleased that we were able to go to Tijuana and to see and talk to people that were from Cameroon, Sierra Leone, and different places, and hear their stories, and through their tears, understand their plight. One of the things that they told us that I think it was so moving to me and painful is to understand the racism that they met and that's prevalent in Mexico towards them. It's one of the situations that's intolerable, and we have to do something about it. We also heard from a person who was Black and LGBTQ and the very difficult situation that she was in. We have to do something about that. To make them stand in a queue as they are today, where they get discriminated against in a country where they don't understand the language, when they have every right, every legal right to come to the United States and ask for asylum, is wrong. And we have to change that. And we have to demand that that changes. We do have special populations that are coming to America to ask for asylum that you can't treat the same because they have a special burden. They don't speak the language, they don't speak Spanish, or they are discriminated against because of their LGBTQ status. And that's why I was very happy, very pleased, and very sad, though, too, to hear them. But it was very important for us to hear that, and I hope we champion their cause. I certainly will. And again, I'm here to listen. I'll shut up now. But I do think it's very important that we hear from you. And again, I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for allowing me to be here. It's been an honor.
Ms. Krishnamurti.
Chairwoman Bass, members of the subcommittee, on behalf of Amnesty International USA, I thank you for holding this important hearing in San Ysidro, and thank you also for your opening remarks, with which I could not agree more. My name is Charanya Krishnaswami, and I am the America's Advocacy Director of the U.S. Country Section of Amnesty International. A top priority for our organization has been the treatment of migrants and asylum seekers at the U.S. southern border. A few weeks ago, we were actually just here, as well as in South Texas, to investigate the massive violations of human rights taking place at our border. During this most recent trip, we visited a site I never imagined I would see in my lifetime, a refugee camp on the border of the United States in the Mexican city of Matamoros, which sits right across the bridge from Texas. The camp is filled with people who have been subjected to an inhumane administration policy known as Remain in Mexico, which forcibly returns them to Mexico while they fight their proceedings in the United States. Hundreds of tents and tarps were patched together, and over 1,000 people, including families with babies and young children, were struggling to survive in precarious and unsanitary conditions as they desperately waited for their next court date. One medical responder who's worked in humanitarian crises around the world described the camp in Matamoros as, quote, one of the worst situations she has ever seen. How did we get here? Anti-asylum policies by the United States have created this humanitarian crisis. Because, to be clear, this is a crisis manufactured by the deliberate policy choices of this administration. The dire humanitarian situation we now see at the border, from that refugee camp to asylum seekers being kidnapped by cartels, to families dying as they attempt to cross the U.S. border in their search for safety, are the result of those policy choices. By law, the United States has an obligation to protect people who arrive to our border in search of safety, to ensure that they are not returned to places where they will face grave harm. People seeking protection here from Central American countries are fleeing levels of violence comparable to those found in war zones. Growing numbers of people from Cuba and Venezuela are seeking safety in the United States from persecution by regimes this administration itself has described as, quote, brutal and, quote, fomenting violence and repression. But instead of faithfully fulfilling its obligation to protect these people, this administration has instead sought to eviscerate asylum access in as many ways as possible. Amnesty International was right here in San Ysidro on January 28th, the very day the first asylum seeker was returned to Tijuana under the Remain in Mexico policy. Mere months later, over 60,000 people, including families, children, and countless vulnerable people here in search of safety, have been shipped back to dangerous conditions in Mexico under this policy. There are over 400 documented reports of individuals who have been subjected to kidnappings, sexual assaults, extortion attempts, and other violent attacks after being sent back to Mexico. One asylum seeker I saw in court recently was a father from El Salvador. His baby daughter was sitting in his lap. Through tears, he told the judge how he was kidnapped in the plain presence of Mexican patrol cars, along with other returnees, headed to their court dates in the United States. He was let go because he had no money, but he still has no idea what happened to those other men. These stories of harm are so commonplace that one legal services provider who works with returnees commented to Amnesty that, quote, "For people returned under the program, it's not a question of whether they'll get kidnapped, it's a question of when." As if this weren't enough, the U.S. has now commenced a dangerous plan to ship asylum seekers to danger through a series of, quote, safe third country agreements with Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, countries that are anything but safe. Like the near total ban on asylum announced in July, these agreements are predicated on the fiction that countries whose conditions are dangerous for many of their own nationals are somehow safe for vulnerable asylum seekers. People should not be forced to seek safety in danger. Until we recommit to a fair, safe, and humane response to those seeking protection at our shores, the humanitarian crisis at our border will not cease. Congress must act now to stop the human rights violations taking place in our name. First, we urge Congress to prohibit any federal dollars from being spent on policies that limit access to asylum at the border. Our dollars cannot be spent to implement Remain in Mexico and other outrageous anti-asylum policies. Second, we encourage Congress to support measures that recommit us to a fair and just asylum system, including the Refugee Protection Act, which was just introduced yesterday. Third, we ask Congress to ensure funding for a holistic, rights-respecting response to people seeking protection at our border, one which targets the root causes of displacement and ensures a fair process right here in the United States. Asylum seekers at our border can wait no longer. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Stevens?
Chairwoman, members, thank you very much for inviting me here today. I'm here in my personal capacity as a concerned citizen and as a former asylum officer. As I'm sure you're aware, the Migrant Protection Protocol, otherwise known as MPP or Remain in Mexico, has started being implemented in January of this year. After a rocky start, it was fully implemented this summer and hit the San Francisco Asylum Office in June. In August, I was asked to perform those interviews. Every asylum officer I have talked to feels deeply conflicted about these interviews. We are being asked to take individuals who we know are vulnerable and send them back to a situation where we know they will be harmed. It is the exact opposite of the task that we were set out to do when we signed up to be asylum officers. The problem is complicated and varied, but really, for me as an ex-asylum officer, I faced an internal dilemma. I did 5 interviews, and I looked at these individuals, all of them families, who suffered significant harms while transiting through Mexico, who I then had to return because the policy is created such that nobody, or almost nobody, can succeed in staying in the United States and gaining protection. I stepped back from my role as an asylum officer and put on my lawyer hat and looked at whether or not these policies are legal. For me, I needed to address how I, as a government employee and a lawyer, could implement a policy that felt so internally wrong. And that is the question that every asylum officer is asking themselves, whether they've left the Asylum Corps or not. The conclusion was quick and easy. The program is illegal, and it's very illegal in multiple ways. This wasn't a close call. I raised those concerns with the local administration, first with my supervisors and then with the head of the office, when the only reaction was for them to start disciplinary proceedings for being insubordinate and refusing to do orders. I went to Congress and I notified Senator Merkley, and then After that, I decided that it was in my best interest to leave the Asylum Corps. I had up until then been a dedicated civil servant. I had no intention of leaving, but I felt that I could not continue in my role as it was being mandated. In my written statements, I detail all of the reasons that I have found that the program is illegal. Some of them are nuanced, some of them are not. I think the core of it that everyone here is feeling is that the program is designed to prevent vulnerable populations from remaining in the United States, and it is discriminatory in its intent and its application. And this discrimination is not focused solely on individuals from Central America, although that is the core of the people being subject to the program right now. As you just indicated, you're very aware that there's migration through Mexico from all parts of the world. I personally have interviewed individuals that have come through Mexico from every continent, and with Africa in particular, Cameroon, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Nigeria, and the Congo. Possibly more, but those are the ones that I can recall. This program, MPP, is part of a larger process by this administration to completely destroy the asylum program within the United States. It is the most visible in that it is creating a humanitarian crisis on our border and turning would-be asylum seekers into refugees in Mexico. It is placing those individuals in extreme danger. I have many stories of my own and stories that my colleagues asked me to share. Unfortunately, I do not have time to do that, but would happy to do that at a later request. I ask of you in your roles to do a couple of things. One, please continue to shed a light on this issue. I know politics are crazy right now. I know that this is not maybe getting the attention it deserves, but it is an ongoing crisis of our own making. Second, I ask you to support whistleblowers and other individuals of conscience that feel the need to speak out. I can't say I speak for all asylum officers, but every person that has contacted me before or after I took my actions has expressed nothing but support. I know that my concerns are shared with the vast majority of the people in the government. Thank you.
Ms. Clark.
Good afternoon, Chairwoman Bass and members of the subcommittee. My name is Kate Clark, and I'm an attorney and the Senior Director of Immigration Services at Jewish Family Service of San Diego. I thank you for this hearing and for raising attention on these important border issues that we've been dealing now with for the better of 11 months. As a legal service provider along the southern border and as the operator of San Diego's only migrant family shelter, we would like to draw your attention to the need to protect asylum seekers arriving along our southern border. In January, as already been noted, the Migrant Protection Protocols, commonly referred to as Remain in Mexico, was implemented in our region. This policy forces most asylum seekers and their families to return to Mexico. Under the program's guidelines, unaccompanied minors and vulnerable individuals, including individuals with significant medical issues, are supposed to be exempted. However, we have seen many cases where these vulnerable populations have not been excluded from the policy. Let me tell you just about one. On August 18th of this year, I crossed into Tijuana, Mexico, just after 3:45 in the morning. The purpose for this early morning trip was to escort a 16-year-old unaccompanied minor mother and her 1-year-old child who had been enrolled into MPP despite the DHS guidelines. Our teenaged client and her infant were requested to appear at the San Ysidro port of entry at 4:30 in the morning to be transported for her 7:30 hearing at the San Diego Immigration Court. On top of the obvious and logistical hurdles that this family faced while showing up at the right place at the right time just to be transported to court, our clients had to travel through Tijuana, one of the most dangerous cities in the world, in the dark of night to present themselves at the border. This is a journey that we feel is not appropriate, safe, or even possible to do or accomplish without accompaniment. Today, I can report that our client and her young child are now in the United States and continue their asylum proceedings in safety. But this result could only be attributed to a significant amount of advocacy and litigation that we conducted in court. I can also report that this case is not an anomaly. We commonly are in contact with individuals and families who have been enrolled into MPP with serious medical conditions, which should be exempted from the MPP program. As just one of a few legal service providers in our region providing legal representation to asylum seekers who have been enrolled into MPP, Jewish Family Service works to meet the needs of all vulnerable asylum seekers. Despite the glaring geographical and logistical barriers, JFS has conducted hundreds of consultations for individuals and families who have been returned to Mexico. And there are several apparent common themes that remain. The first is a lack of an understanding of the process, uncertainty about why they're being returned, queries about what the next steps are, questions about whether they will be able to be granted entry into the United States and have a safe situation for them and their families. And of course, then there's the continued reports of family separation. To alleviate some of this confusion, Jewish Family Service of San Diego has made an official request to the Department of Justice to provide critical Know Your Rights presentations to individuals and families who have been transported to court. We've even offered to serve as a friend of court and assist during hearings. All of this would be done at no cost to the U.S. government, but despite these requests and despite the significant benefits, our requests have been categorically denied without any reason to support this immensely vulnerable population. Next, I will move to access to counsel. Less than 2% of this population has representation by counsel. Even this 2% that has counsel have no ability to communicate with their clients while they're in DHS custody. A lawsuit was recently ensued by the ACLU of San Diego and Imperial Counties, and for the first time since January of 2019, we've been able to communicate with our clients in a confidential setting, adequately prepare them for their non-refoulement interview, and be present for the non-refoulement interview, which I'll note the stakes are high. They're life and death. Are the families going to be individuals or families going to be granted entry into the United States or returned to Mexico, as the subcommittee has known and seen to very grave circumstances. Specifically to address the egregious policy that is MPP, Jewish Family Service recommends Congress take the following steps. Call on the Department of Homeland Security to follow the clear guidance that was issued regarding the disqualifying grounds for enrollment into MTP, including but not limited to the vulnerable populations. Second, exclude women and children from being placed on the 8 a.m. docket to be transported to the immigration court so that this vulnerable population does not have to travel to Tijuana, Mexico in the dark of night. And 3, call upon the Department of Justice, Office of Legal Assistance Programs to allow Know Your Rights presentations or a Friend of the Court program for the MPP dockets in immigration courts around the country. Now I'd like to briefly turn over to another critical issue here in San Diego, which has impacted our community, known as the end of the Safe Release program, which is now called the Quick Release effort. We've assisted. Yes. Oh, we've assisted over 19,000 individuals since the Safe Release program had ended, including hundreds of Africans, asylum seekers that are seeking protection. And without the support of community NGOs, including JFS and other members of the Rapid Response Network, these individuals would be on the streets, subject to a number of vulnerable situations.
Wow, thank you. Ms. Gyamfi?
Yes. Thank you so much. I always have to make sure I'm a short person. Got to get the mic near me. Good afternoon. Thank you, Chairwoman Bass, and thank you to all the members of the subcommittee for having this hearing and for inviting me to speak today. My name is Nana Gyamfi. As you pointed out, I'm the executive director of the Black Alliance for Just Immigration, and we come to this work concerned and focused on, Black migrants who have been pretty much rendered invisible in this conversation about immigration for so many years now, even though we are here. We can't say how many thousands of Black migrants there are in Mexico or in Tijuana because the people aren't doing that accurate count. But we know that there are thousands, and the estimates are up to 10,000 Black migrants that are in Mexico between Tijuana and Tapachula. I want to talk about what is happening with the Black migrant using a sister that we met, an Angolan sister that we met in Tapachula. She came from Angola. She was a human rights, a women's rights activist there. She left Angola because the government had sent word that they were going to kill her. They didn't even do it slyly. They made it clear. And so she went with her family, left Angola and went to Ecuador. Chose Ecuador, as many African folks do, because Ecuador at that time had an open visa. This administration has since pressured Ecuador to change that and to close that visa gap up. But it had this open visa, and so African migrants went there, and Ana and her family were amongst them. When they got to Ecuador, many of them hoped they could stay there, but then they could not, and they left. They crossed thousands of miles by foot, by bus, by car, finally coming to the Darien Gap. And at the Darien Gap, which is near Panama and Colombia, between Colombia and Panama, they crossed for 5 days without sleeping. They call it the Migrant Graveyard. They walked, stepping over bodies, watching other people in their party drop dead, seeing people raped before their very eyes. And when they came across the other side into Panama, they were taken into detention for a short while as they continued through their journey, ending up going through Honduras, climbing a wall, taking a horse, walking, getting into Guatemala, and finally getting into Mexico. Now, I want to point out that Ana did this with her family before the third safe country agreement that Guatemala now has with the United States, so does Honduras and El Salvador, which would have required them to apply for asylum against international law in those countries. You have a right under international law to apply for asylum in the country of your choice. And now people are forced to apply in countries that are not of their choice. But at that time, she was able with her family to go through. I also want to point out that Ana's family consists of her husband and 7 children. The youngest child being 3 years old, the oldest child being about 16. And you try to imagine them walking, carrying their children, stepping over dead bodies. She talked about covering their eyes, covering their ears, so they wouldn't hear the moans and screams of agony, so they wouldn't see the corpses lying on the ground. And then finally getting into Tapachula, Mexico, a place where you used to be able to just travel through. You got there, they gave you an exit visa, you went on to the northern border so you could present yourself for asylum, but not anymore, because the Trump administration wielded its hammer of trade and tariffs and decided to, and forced the Mexican government, induced the Mexican government to change its liberal policy to one in which it now requires you to apply for asylum in Mexico. And so when Ana and her family got to Mexico after going through all of that, they were immediately detained. They were held in Siglo 21, the largest detention center in Latin America, for over a month, including the children, including the toddler, all the way up. They were fed food that had maggots in it. They had no sanitation. They existed in conditions that are described by human rights activists there as slave ship-like conditions. And as Black folks, we know what that means. And then they were finally released. And upon being released, they were left out there with nothing, no food, no water, no housing. Chairwoman Bass, when you talk about what happens in Uganda, when you talk about what happens in Tanzania, that's not what happens in these countries. But this is what happens in Mexico, in Tapachula, and right here across the border in Tijuana, to Black migrants who can't go to shelters. The shelters tell them, we don't know how to handle Black people. They take their children to school. The schools tell them, we don't know how to teach Black children. Somehow they make it seem as if Black people are some alien human coming from some other planet that they cannot deal with, and it just boils down to rank racism. Ana and her family We don't know where they are now. We know that they tried, along with another group of Cameroonians, to escape Tapachula. You cannot leave Tapachula. People are being held in captivity, what one of the Congolese described as a state of dotage, where they're just being held with no purpose. You know, a hoarder holds with a purpose. They think later in life they might actually use you. This is just holding people for no reason whatsoever.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You will all have an opportunity to continue talking. I just want us to now move into the time when the Congress members can question witnesses under a 5-minute rule, and we'll alternate back and forth. So I will go last. This will be the order in which we'll take questions from members. Representative Vargas, Representative Lee, Representative Davis, and Representative Clark, and then I will go after that.
Again, thank you, Madam Chair. My first question is to you, Ms. Gyamfi. You were there today, obviously, and you heard the discrimination that you've just described, but we heard it from the people that were there too. What should we do? I mean, there's a terrible secret. It's not a secret that in Mexico there's a lot of racism against people who are indigenous, people who are Indians in Mexico, and also people who are black, also people who are Asian. The same racism you see in the United States, you see in Mexico. And what we heard today is something that we shouldn't tolerate, and we should have a solution. What do you think we should do?
There's two things I would say. The first thing is that what I've seen from Guatemala all the way up is a repetition of the same kind of racist, anti-black rhetoric that we hear from this president. And they literally are saying it. As President Trump says, right? And so you're seeing that. I saw a sign that said, "Get out of our neighborhood or we will lynch you." Lynchiamos. I don't even think that's Spanish.
It's not.
Right? So they're literally taking the terms of white supremacists and applying those terms now. So that's the first thing, checking the racism and anti-blackness in this country at every turn, because that's being exported. Secondly, to support organizations and efforts that allow folks to see themselves. Because as much as the good work that folks are doing at the border in different organizations, when you go somewhere and you actually see, I'm Congolese, and I see someone that's Congolese or someone at least that's black, that makes a difference. If I'm indigenous and I at least see someone that's indigenous that can speak my language, that makes a difference. And so that support and the shining the light, I think, is also very important.
What about I think the queue that they have, the queuing system is illegal to begin with. One, but secondly, what about giving people that don't speak Spanish? I mean, so many of the people we spoke to, they testified, they didn't know what people were talking, they didn't even know how to line up because they didn't speak Spanish. And then obviously discrimination that goes against people that are LGBTQ also. Shouldn't we allow them their legal rights to come and present themselves in the United States without having to stand in any queue?
Yeah, I agree with you. I think the metering is just illegal, period. So I wouldn't argue for any carve-out.
But with a sensitive population, don't you think that we should give priority?
Absolutely.
I think that that's something that we need to look at. Why not give priority to people that don't speak the language or that are sensitive, vulnerable populations?
Absolutely, I would agree with that.
Anyone else like to comment on that?
Certainly, if I may, thank you so much for your observations. I would say that one of the reasons I think we're seeing individuals from non-Spanish-speaking countries being particularly victimized by metering lists and by enforcement in Mexico is precisely because Remain in Mexico, by its terms, applies to nationals of Spanish-speaking countries, although it includes many indigenous people who do not speak Spanish. And so what we see is that the Trump administration and Mexican administrations are enforcing these other anti-asylum, anti-access to territory policies against people who wouldn't be subject to remain in Mexico. So that's why they're being, kept on these metering lists, being made to wait for months. That's why they're being held back by Mexican enforcement officials at Mexico's southern border, because they can't just be quickly returned under the Remain in Mexico policy. So I think that's how these awful anti-asylum policies
And this is somewhat new, is it not?
Which all of these policies combined, yes, like Remain in Mexico started in 2019.
Right.
Metering has been going on since
Right,
about-
no, but I'm saying, it seems to me under this new president in Mexico that he in fact has followed the lead of President Trump and done what President Trump has asked him to do. It didn't seem like this was a process before. We understand they used to get people who'd come and present themselves and get a visa to travel through Mexico, that now instead of getting that, they get the military there and they get the police, and they stop them and they don't allow them to move, which my understanding before was illegal under the Mexican Constitution. And this is something that before, they'd always say, well, we can't stop people from migrating because it's in our Constitution. Now all of a sudden, magically, they can.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because initially, under the first months of this new administration in Mexico, there was much more openness, right? In Tapachula, you know, the first, like back in January, the initial caravan coming to the U.S., coming northward, was allowed in. They were given wristbands and granola bars, and then we saw Trump slap those tariff threats on Mexico. And to Ms. Gyamfi's point, a complete 180 in enforcement.
My time has expired. There is a moment of pride, I have to say, that, Ms. Clark, I appreciate the work that you've done here in San Diego, and been there a number of times to see what you guys do. It's just so incredibly important. I have another 5 minutes probably at some point, but I just, in case I don't, I wanted to make sure that I said that, because I've been over the place a number of times, and it's incredible what you guys do. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Representative Lee?
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, for this hearing and for your leadership, and thank all of my colleagues, and thank all of you for being here and really providing us what we need to go back to Congress. This has been a very emotional, in many ways, visit, but it's also been one that has inspired us to learn more and do more. So thank you. First, people are fleeing violence in their own country. They're coming through a very treacherous and dangerous journey to get to the Mexico border, hoping to enter the United States. People die. And yet, they're still, as they move through this process, they're totally dehumanized in this process and traumatized through the journey and right here in Mexico, with the stamp of approval from my own country, our own country, the United States of America. It's another stain on this country, and it's a shame and disgrace. Now, we know, I'm an appropriator, and I was also on the conference committee on Homeland Security that negotiated the opening of the government. So you know the politics of what we're dealing with. We tried to end the Stay in Mexico policy, couldn't get the votes to do that. We tried to fence in and deny funding unless some humane some humane services and policies would emanate from what we were doing through the funding. You know what happened there in terms of the policy. So let me just ask you a couple of things, given where we are. This year, we're in the process right now of negotiating these bills. And I put in, and I'll read you just the language, and we don't know where this is going to go. The Department of Homeland Security shall not enter into or renew any contract with any entity to operate an immigration detention facility that does not provide the availability and proximity of free immigration legal service providers. We're trying to do that. Yet, again, we know what we're dealing with in terms of this white supremacy agenda that's emanating from the White House. So short of what we can and can't do now in Washington, we're going to keep fighting through all of the committees that we're on. What are some of the human rights and humanitarian issues that we need to raise with the United Nations? We'll be there next week. And I want to know what role the UN and other organizations can help us with in addressing these horrific humanitarian concerns and protections of people leaving the Northern Triangle and through their treacherous journeys. What can the UN and other organizations do? Because, again, elections have consequences, and we're dealing with that. And we're trying, even within that context, to try to bring some justice to our migrant, immigration, and refugee policies. But in the meantime, we need to take this a little bit higher. And so could you kind of tell me what we need to know as we go to the UN next week?
I mean, I can say a few things. We have been looking as Baji at the United Nations Commission on Human Rights They have an office that's in Tapachula. I believe they have an office that's here in Tijuana as well. What we found in Tapachula is that they just need more, they need more of a backbone, they need more support, they need something to enable them to push back against the Mexican government. Because right now, for example, we know that making someone file request asylum in a country that's not of their choice is against international law. But the UNCHR is helping people file asylum. So that's helping people to violate international law, right? So they need help on that kind of pushback. The children, looking at the most vulnerable populations, again, the children, there are children everywhere, right here, whether we're talking about Little Haiti and what we see here in the African populations in Tijuana or in Tapachula, they're not going to school. They don't have access to food. People don't have access to water. They don't have access to be able to clean themselves. They don't have access to housing. They don't have access to restrooms. They don't have access to medical care. I mean, they just don't have the basics that are needed. You know, even as children, nothing special is happening for them, nothing special happening for pregnant women. So we can go down the list of human rights that we have as human beings, and we can say that each and every one of them are being violated in this process. And so UNCHR, UNICEF, you know, all of those organizations that focus on uplifting vulnerable populations, LGBTQ populations. Those are the folks that I would speak with at the UN and press to say, hey, what are you doing? As well as the Organization of American States. I believe that's also very important. Baji sent them a letter, and it would be so useful to have Congress help back us up with that.
Good. Would you like to?
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. It's great to hear that you'll be dialoguing with the UN next week. I will just say that this is absolutely a regional problem, particularly as the U.S. continues to try to externalize its borders, first to Mexico, now to Guatemala, soon to El Salvador and Honduras with these safe third country agreements. And so it really is the UN as the global body that is in a good position to be able to say, this is a blatant violation of the rights guaranteed under the 1951 Refugee Convention and its 1967 protocol, to which we are a party. And these instruments were created because we learned an awful lesson in the wake of World War II when we slammed the door in the face of people fleeing a genocide. Today we have people fleeing violence who are being sent back to danger. So really the UN, if it can speak up with a single voice and criticize these policies for what they are, violations of these sacred texts that protect refugees and bind us all as an international community, I think that would be enormously powerful.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Representative Davis.
Thank you, and I certainly want to thank my colleagues and particularly Chairwoman Bass for this field hearing. It's very important, and it gives really all of you a chance to see and hear, but also have your questions. And really, I think you have great experiences, all of you here in the room, and you wouldn't be here if you hadn't had those and been very much a part of this. I want to just turn to Ms. Krishnaswami for a second, and really just first to applaud everyone for the role you play, because it's also absolutely critical. And what concerns me, what is so troubling, is the treatment of humanitarian aid workers along the border. And so I want to ask you a little bit about that. Tell us about that. What have you seen?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Congresswoman, for the question. Amnesty International has documented an incredibly worrying pattern and practice of the U.S. government targeting, surveilling, and harassing lawyers and advocates and even journalists who are working with migrant populations along the border. This at a time when U.S. policies necessitate this kind of cross-border work, right? We heard from Kate about how she had to go to Tijuana at 3 a.m. to find a vulnerable family subjected to this policy. There are brave U.S. attorneys and legal services providers who are doing this Herculean work and are now being targeted for it by the U.S. government, put on surveillance lists. There was actually one such list leaked to NBC San Diego a few months back, which I'm sure you all saw, with, X's on the faces of folks who are frequently engaged in this type of work. The prosecution of Scott Warren, a humanitarian aid worker who was prosecuted for trying to save lives in the desert. Thankfully, he was just acquitted this week because our juries have more more sense than the government that's trying to prosecute them. But this is absolutely a worrying trend, and one we encourage and hope Congress will continue to conduct oversight of.
In your experience and the experience of all of you, do you see that the U.S. government is monitoring closely the activities of many of these humanitarian workers?
Absolutely. They've done so under this justification that they could be violating a broadly written criminal statute. That's 8 U.S.C. 1324, which prohibits the smuggling of migrants. And so they say that work like what Scott Warren is engaged in, trying to save the lives of some of the most vulnerable people, is tantamount to smuggling. And that's because that law doesn't have a humanitarian exemption that says, hey, if you're engaged in the provision of life-saving work, you should not be surveilled or harassed or investigated for this kind of behavior. And so we're seeing a misuse of these criminal statutes, politically motivated prosecutions.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you. Would that be important legislation? We've actually been working on that to be sure that they are exempted.
And we thank you very much for your office's work on this. We think it's absolutely an important issue.
Yeah. Ms. Clark, do you want to respond as well? Because with the ready response teams, you certainly have seen these great concerns about being monitored and being treated in a way that does not allow them to work freely.
Sure. I'd like to say that every time that I cross the border, I do prepare myself to be sent to secondary. I have yet to be sent to secondary, but I've had many staff sent to secondary, questioned for the purpose of their visit, why they're going to Mexico, what specifically they're doing. And we're in a situation of, again, going to Mexico for clients that are in this vulnerable situation already under circumstances of immense stress. And so preparing our clients in this situation, preparing ourselves individually to be subject to additional questioning and scrutiny is not only a violation of law, but it's inappropriate and gross in light of the egregious policies that have been implemented to cause this circumstance.
Ms. Gyamfi, would you like to respond as well?
Thank you.
Mr. Stevens, please. We have 46 seconds.
Baji doesn't do taking people across, but what we have found is people being targeted just because they think that you're teaching folks how to lie, because you're giving them legal workshops on critical fear. And so we've seen and heard of attorneys and legal workers who have found themselves being questioned again, going through that secondary questioning because they now think that you're one of the people that is on the other side. There's a very, our side, yours, them and us attitude that has been developed with regard to human rights work at the border.
Mr. Stevens?
So I do not have direct-hand knowledge of discriminatory acts towards aid workers. I will say that when we were trained on MPP, we were explicitly told that we were not allowing any migrants to have legal representation, and we were told that we would not delay or otherwise reschedule an interview to give them an opportunity to find and have representation.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you to all of you.
Representative Clark?
Let me thank you, Madam Chair, for this really wonderful and really edifying hearing. Let me thank all of our panelists for sharing your expertise with us today. This is really critical as we look at a broken system and remedies that we're going to need to fix it going forward. So thank you. Mr. Stevens, I definitely wanted to just take a moment to thank you for your patriotism, quite frankly, to step forward and shine a light on what is taking place in the name of all Americans, yourself being one, and the work that you've had to do and the rules and regulations you were subjected to that called you to call this all into question is remarkable. So I want to thank you for your patriotism and your courage. I wanted to start with the issue of these third country agreements, because this is probably the new factor that has created the most troubling of circumstances. And so I want to get from each of you, how have the safe third country agreements with Central American governments been conceptualized and negotiated, and what, if any, U.S. assistance might accompany such agreements? What have you seen? I'll start with you, Ms. Krishnaswami.
Krishnaswami.
I got it, Krishnaswami.
It's fine. I know it's 12 letters. It's a long name. So that's a great question. Thank you so much, Congresswoman, for asking that. What we've seen is the U.S. basically strong-arming and bullying these our regional neighbors into signing these counterfactual agreements. These are not safe third countries. They have deviated from established practices. The only other safe third country agreement we've ever negotiated has been the U.S.-Canada agreement, which has its own set of problems, and Amnesty is actually challenging that in Canadian court because the U.S. is no longer a safe country for asylum seekers. But these regional agreements have been signed, have really been led by the Department of Homeland Security, not the Department of State. It seems like DHS has really taken the lead role in diplomacy in Central America now, which is an absolute, it's topsy-turvy. This is not how this is supposed to be. What we've also seen is that the Guatemala agreement just began to be implemented this previous week. Some other brave, probably asylum officers leaked some implementing guidance that say that the agreement will apply to Hondurans and El Salvadorans for now, but nothing in the text of this rule that was published last week, which describes how these counterfactual agreements will be implemented, limits it to people who've transited through the countries, people from particular nationalities. So theoretically, I mean, at some point, these agreements could be applied against anybody seeking protection at our southern border. It's deeply, deeply concerning, given that under the asylum law, as Congress has passed it, these agreements can only be entered when there is a full and fair asylum process and where asylum seekers' lives or freedoms will not be threatened in that third country. Neither of those conditions is met under the circumstances of any of these agreements.
Thank you. Mr. Stevens.
Thank you. Thankfully, I did not have to implement any of these. This all happened after I left the office. I have conducted many interviews of asylum seekers from all of the countries that are now quote-unquote safe third countries. So I do think counterfactual is a good term for it. It's hard to see how a country where you're already receiving a significant amount of asylum applicants could be safe for other individuals being sent back there. I have not looked closely at the legality, but I think it would face the same sort of problems that MPP faces in terms of its discrimination, in terms of its denial of due process, also in its essential affront to the principle of non-refoulement and our obligation to not return someone to a location where it's more likely than not that they would be persecuted or tortured.
Very well. Ms. Clark.
I'll share two things. So I would say that first and foremost is the chaos on the ground that's ensuing. I mentioned in my testimony that it's abundantly clear that individuals and families have no understanding of what's happening. So with these safe third-party country agreements, I think that's a layered upon that. And then second, I'd say I have a concern as a practitioner of law in this field. So this nuance, these policies that are coming rapid fire, one after another, are creating essentially a subset of immigration attorneys that are practicing in the border region. And rather unfortunately, if you're not in that group, then it's a larger area of law that's not really being expanded from a knowledge perspective to other practitioners across the U.S. So it then just falls upon this smaller subset of practitioners.
Very well. My time is up. I'm hoping we'll do, may I extend it? Oh, very well. Would you please
Yes,
answer, Ms. Gyamfi?
briefly, the third safe country agreements, the asylum ban, and what Mexico is doing is basically Trump's invisible wall. This is President Trump's invisible wall that's created by the foreign policy pressure that's been placed on these countries. And they're not safe. In these countries, Black people who are from those countries are not safe. Indigenous people from those countries are not safe. I was in Guatemala. I was told several times, carry that U.S. passport. You are not safe.
Thank you very much. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Yes, and what I thought we would do would be do another round of 5 minutes. And Ms. Clark, I had cut you off in the beginning, so in a minute I'll call on you, and why don't you finish what you were trying to say in the beginning. You know, this is interesting to me because, you know, as we've watched our public hearings over these last couple of weeks in regard to the Ukraine, it's made me think now that it seems like our foreign policy is about bribery, extortion, pressuring other countries. Now, we know in the Ukraine he was doing it for his own personal benefit, for his reelection. But here, I guess this is our new way we get countries to do what we want them to do. And I just wonder what the threat was for these countries. I am guessing, and you know, you guys can respond, but I am guessing that the threat was their foreign aid, whether it was USAID or what other foreign aid. If you don't go along and if you don't cooperate with us, then we won't give you your foreign aid. And I don't know if you guys know anything about that, but you know, you can respond to it in a second. I did want to take a minute and thank the members of the audience, because there's a lot of other places you could be this afternoon. You chose to be here, and I know I look at the audience and I know that there's several people that traveled quite a ways to come here, and I really appreciate that, because this is such a critical issue. And I say everywhere I go that if you fast forward 10 years, we're going to look back at this time period, and this is going to be one of the most shameful periods in U.S. history, where we have somebody who is a open white supremacist who has set the policy. Stephen Miller has been exposed for who he is. I don't know why he's been obsessed around certain immigrants. The president has said from the beginning he welcomes immigrants from Norway. He clearly, the Norwegians said they weren't interested, but he clearly, this is a policy that is steeped in race. And Mr. Stevens, I want to join in thanking you, because, you know, I've wondered throughout this, where were the other Mr. Stevens, you know? And I don't know if they've done what some of my Republican colleagues have done, which is quit in silence. But I just wonder about the people that do the work, especially the people that take babies away. I wonder how they sleep at night. But I so appreciate and congratulate you for stepping forward, and your information is vital. And I wanted to ask you, because you alluded to this in your opening statement, that you had some stories. I'd like for you to share a couple of the policy of MPP and how, you know, what it was before and what people who did your job, what are they facing? What are they doing what are some of the stories they hear about people? And then what happens to those people when they go back to do they go back to their countries, or do they just send everybody to Tijuana, regardless of where you're from?
Well, thank you very much. I can say that like I said, every asylum officer I've talked to is very much struggling with this issue. I know a lot of asylum officers who want to remain in public service have left quietly to try and find other positions within the government. A few, like myself, have left the government entirely. A number of others have remained and continue to try and oppose this policy as best they can from the inside, including attaching cover letters in opposition to every MPP decision that they do. I know officers work tirelessly doing 3 to 5 hour interviews in an attempt to get a positive decision, only to have that rejected later on. So I think the officers themselves are very much struggling with the choice of whether or not they should stay, knowing, like me, leaving weakens the program overall and is in some ways a victory for the administration. With regard to stories, if I may, one that stuck out in my mind was of a Honduran man and his young son who transited across Mexico. It took them approximately 1 month.
From where?
They were Honduran.
Oh, Honduran, I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
And during that time, they witnessed cartels murdering and torturing other migrants. They were robbed by the police of all of their possessions and money. They had to take the train across Mexico, which subjected them to additional violence from other migrants and Mexicans, including a number of death threats. They were not allowed to remain in the United States. I was told a story the other day of a woman who, after 4 hours of being interviewed, admitted to being raped by the police And she had not said that earlier because the interview was not being conducted in a private environment and people were coming in and out of the room. I've heard of stories of, a lot of stories actually of domestic violence from cartels and also from police officers. And in all of those instances, the administration is directing the supervisors and headquarters to tell the officers that that is insufficient, that that is not torture, and that those individuals can return to Mexico and be safe. And I think what's not really taken into account legally when making that decision, determination for the officers, is that those migrants, whether or not they might be safe somewhere else in Mexico, really can't go anywhere else because they're in removal proceedings in the United States. And they have to stay at areas that we are telling our own citizens not to travel to.
Ms. Clark, you want to finish what you were trying to say earlier?
Thank you. So in late October of 2018, the DHS had changed basically another policy known as the Safe Release Program and implemented the Quick Release Program, which essentially allowed families that were processed by the Department of Homeland Security to be released into the United States. And while this is a great thing, families are not being detained, there was no infrastructure or ability to respond, leaving thousands of migrant families vulnerable to a number of situations. So as I mentioned, over 19,000 individuals, all family units, have been released since last October of 2018. And we continue to welcome our guests every single night. But I'd like to note that what is consistent from interviewing and talking to the migrant families that are dropped at our doorstep is the horrible conditions that they're being held in the short-term DHS facilities. Consistently, families are dropped with lice, scabies, other communicable conditions, dehydration. And so it's very problematic to have these families not only in detention, but be subject to a lot of the behavioral health results that can happen while in detention, so the traumatic and stress-inducing environment that the families are subject to. So I'd also ask this subcommittee to continue to provide oversight to these short-term facilities. Specifically, I think more recently there's been an effort that has been undertaken to monitor the facilities, and I think that it's helped. I've seen some improvement, but it's critical to continue this monitoring so that we can ensure that every single facility, whether it's a private facility, from ICE or Border Patrol facility, Customs and Border Protection, OFO facility, that they meet the standards to, at least have minimum food, water, basic sanitation to provide to any individual, which is a basic human right.
Thank you. Representative Vargas?
Thank you very much. I think what might be instructive to the committee is if you take us through the process of two different people, a person that comes from El Salvador, a person that comes from Cameroon, arrives in Tijuana, and goes through the process and assume that unfortunately they're not granted asylum. I think people would be interested in that process. I know there's been a lot of questions about that. Would you mind doing that for us?
Sure. So the person, and I'd just like to make a distinction before I start that there is a distinction between people, individuals, and families, right? So there's a completely separate process for families. But specifically for the individual from Cameroon, assuming that he makes it through the metering process, assuming that he or she is presenting at the port, or then makes their way and crosses in between ports and is apprehended, that individual will be returned to Mexico at this point under MPP to await immigration proceedings that are going to take place in the U.S. in San Diego currently, if it's at this border here. So that individual, if lucky, will be able to get a shelter at one of the many overcrowded and overrun shelters, but I'd say that oftentimes individuals are subject to be homeless on the streets, kidnapped. We've heard multiple stories of the vulnerabilities and precarious situations that are faced by individuals that are returned to Mexico. They then have to show up to court. If they're able to retain counsel, then they have an advocate. They're the less than 2% that have retained counsel. If they win their asylum proceedings, which is a very, very, very small subset of the population, then the government could appeal. And we've seen the government at this point try to return these individuals who have won their asylum proceedings back to Mexico despite being granted asylum in the United States, which again is a very, very important point to note. And then the individual from Cameroon would face those same situations of metering and being able to be presented, taken into custody, and they would be sent to immigration detention. So there's a detention facility, not too far from here, really up the road, the Otay Mesa Detention Facility. That individual would be detained and go through the same situation, the same asylum process with a judge in the immigration court, potentially be represented by counsel, but not, I think, often. The Otay Mesa Detention Facility hovers between around 60 to 80% on any given day go unrepresented. And if they are successful, then of course the same appellate process continues.
Now, I hate to ask you again because you've had to explain that, but why don't you explain what used to happen before this president came in, because the opportunities were much more profound for people to actually gain asylum, before they changed all the regulations, before they really tried to make it so nobody could get asylum.
Sure. So individuals would still be sent to detention, rather unfortunately. But I'd say that the largest difference, obviously, is somebody not being sent back to an unsafe situation in another country that's not the United States, despite the ability for somebody that is fleeing for and seeking asylum, right? They're fearing persecution based on race, religion, national origin, membership of a particular social group or political opinion. They're fleeing all these situations, and yet they're not reaching a safe situation. So I'd say most importantly, they're being granted entry into the United States.
That's right. In fact, virtually no one was being returned back to Mexico. They were in fact processing that. Isn't that your experience, Mr. Stevens? You were an asylum officer.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. So under the previous system, every individual who either presented themselves at the border or was apprehended crossing the border would be placed in detention and given a credible fear standard, or credible fear interview. And the standard for that interview is actually quite low. It's essentially the asylum officers conduct those, and their goal is to determine if that individual has a substantial likelihood of winning an asylum claim at a full hearing. Asylum itself has a relatively low standard of a 1 in 10 chance, generally. And so really you're looking at if there's a chance of someone making a claim and allowing them to remain in the United States and giving them an opportunity to have counsel and do that.
Yeah. My time has almost expired. The reason I wanted to emphasize that is that before, once you reached, in a sense, the shores of the United States, once you reached America, you really did reach safety, and you really did have an opportunity to stay, a meaningful opportunity, and you had potential to have an attorney. All these things have been taken away.
Okay, the gentleman yield.
Yeah, of course.
I mean, as you were saying that, I was thinking about some of the migrants that we saw today who couldn't even speak. They were so obviously traumatized that they couldn't even get through a basic conversation without crying inconsolably. And I just think about what you said of what it used to be like. It's just shameful. Representatively.
Yeah, following up on that, we heard from one woman who presented herself at a medical center or hospital, and she needed medical care and was effectively denied medical care, and she knew why, and it was because she was black. So wanted to ask you, just in terms of the discrimination here in Mexico and the institutional racism and the laws that may or may not be on the books here, how are institutions, especially like hospitals and healthcare centers and schools and other entities, how are they able to treat black people like this?
I'll take a crack at that. This went throughout the Northern Triangle, coming up through Mexico. This is normal. the Mexican government did not start counting black people in the census, and then they did it as like let's see how this works out, like till 2 or 3 years ago. And there are more black people that were kidnapped and dragged to Mexico and Peru than were ever taken to the United States during the transatlantic slave trade. So it's not because black people are brand new in these countries, right? So there's nothing that happens to these entities when they engage in this activity. There's not like a civil rights movement that has these civil rights laws and all of that you have in this country. And so, it's really the human rights laws that they look at, but these countries have traditionally not treated black folks as human beings, have not given us our humanity, have dehumanized black people, and so that's how it's being expressed, continuing to this day.
Well, I just have to say, I'm vice chair of the subcommittee that funds our U.S. government, our development assistance, and all of our non-military initiatives. I'm thinking we should condition some funding pretty soon on how black people are treated, especially black migrants.
Representative Davis.
Thank you, again, to all of you and certainly to everyone in the audience. Recently our San Diego delegation, and I know Ms. Clark knows this and probably others, we sent a letter to the director of the Executive Office of Immigration Review asking for JFS to be allowed as a volunteer friend of the court and provide legal services to asylum seekers. You mentioned that less than 2% of people really have counsel. That's amazing when you think about that. So I'm looking at you, Mr. Stevens, and hearing really with emotion that many people want to do this work. They'd like to be helping in this process and serving as an asylum officer, but find the policies so repugnant that they can't really do that. And one of the things that I heard was that if we had greater capacity to do this, and we use some of the money that we don't think is being used well in the country, the dollars are there, they're just used differently. Is that a solution? I mean, would that be something that if you had large numbers of people truly trained and to be helped, even if the policies are not what we would want at this point, because we're in this, if we can move out of this period, of course, that's what we'd love to see, but we're still here, right? What do you see as something that we could and should be doing in this area that might be helpful so that that number is at least raised to, 15%? What a difference that would make. Can you help with that kind of, what do we need to know to think about that?
I think it's a difficult question because what's really driving the asylum officers out more than anything is the policies. The fact that Remain in Mexico is pushing applicants into Mexico, right, I think is very intentional in that it's preventing them access from attorneys. That's one of the intents. And by preventing them access from attorneys, it's creating a cascade effect in terms of their ability to get asylum or any other immigration benefit further down the line. One of my legal concerns that I noted in the memo is that in order for this program to exist, these individuals have to be placed in removal proceedings. Asylum officers don't adjudicate things in removal proceedings. So the fact that you have asylum officers sitting at their desks on the phone through terrible phone connections, talking to someone who's detained and is in of itself a problem. And really these non-refoulement hearings, as people are calling them, the Remain in Mexico hearings, probably should be happening in front of an immigration judge with full access to representation and the ability to present evidence, if they're even legal to begin with.
And we have many who don't even get a court notice because it's difficult to do that. Ms. Clark, did you want to respond?
So this week, Human Rights First came out with a report saying that it's 10.5 more times likely to succeed in your immigration hearing if you're represented by counsel specific to MPP. In general removal proceedings, not MPP, it's 5 times more likely. So doubly successful, if you will, if you have counsel. I'll note that I think that what I've shared in my testimony is that the lack of information and clarity is the #1 issue I see as a practitioner on the ground. And I think that the Know Your Rights presentations, the legal orientation programs, which are conducted throughout the state and immigration court here, in immigration courts across the country, and in immigration detention centers, is something that is disparately not being allowed for the MPP dockets. And so it's only leading to further questions about discriminating against this vulnerable policy. And I'd like to just also say that, in conversations with families and informing them of process and what's the next step and what they can expect, then families and individuals can make an informed decision. Is this something that they would like to continue with? Because many times what we've seen is the answer is no. I had a call that came through the hotline a couple of months ago that was particularly concerning. It was of a single dad with a young child that basically said, I would rather die in my home country than in a country that I don't know, because the conditions in Mexico when he was returned to Mexico with his son were that concerning and rose to such a grave level.
Can I just say something briefly? I know we're running out of time, but I think it's always important when we talk about investing in assistance to also talk about divesting from harm. So we don't want a system where we have more detention centers, more courts, more this, more that, and more attorneys to go with it. Right? So I think we also need to talk about how do we not have these refugee camps on the border? How do we not have these detention centers? How do we greet folks like we do in Ghana with a glass of water and a request to hear your story, as opposed to handcuffs and a cage? So I think that, it's not just about investing in the positive, but figuring out how do we divest and dismantle this detention enforcement system, a deportation system, criminalization system that we have right now.
Thank you. Have a very, very different policy. Thank you.
Representative Clark?
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'd like to ask Ms. Krishnaswami. Got it. It was going over in my head. What role has the State Department played in developing and monitoring implementation of the MPP and their impact on Mexico?
That's such a good question, and I think one of my colleagues on the panel just noted that one of the regions we're returning vulnerable asylum seekers to has a level 4 do not travel warning by the U.S. State Department. And that's, that refugee camp in Matamoros I mentioned, that sits right in that area. And there are, this incredible group of former teachers, the angry tias and abuelas, angry aunts and grandmas, who are traveling across the border with, just buckets of food and supplies for these people. And, endangering their own safety to do that. That's what's happening right now. What we've seen is a really worrisome absence, I think, of the State Department in any aspect of, negotiation of these treaties, the implementation and rollout of MPP. One thing that's been super concerning is how the State Department is actually funding this quote-unquote voluntary return program of people subjected to remain in Mexico. So what's happening is they are sent back. They're in these awful conditions and this incredibly coercive environment. The International Organization for Migration comes up and says, hey, do you want a bus ticket home? And so literally, in that absence of choice, what are you going to do? And this is where we're choosing to spend our dollars. And so to Congresswoman Davis's point, it really is it is not a question of resources. We have the resources. It's a question of where we choose to channel them. With that $5 billion requested for that border wall, we could hire tens of thousands of asylum adjudicatory officers tomorrow. We're not going to do that, but we could, right? And so it's really just a question of how we choose to channel these resources. And part of the reason I think the administration talks about the asylum system being, overburdened and underfunded, it's because we're not setting it up to work. We're setting it up to fail. And then what the government's doing is trying to shut off access to asylum even further, compounding the problems, creating more crisis. That's what's happening.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. I appreciate that. And let me just ask the panel, how sustainable is the steady buildup of third country nationals in Mexico? How sustainable? how much longer can we continue to do this? And, what do you see as the ramifications?
Well, I think it's going to be pretty sustainable as long as Mexico can get money from the United States. So when you talked earlier about the effects of the Third Safe Country Agreement and those, what does that also mean? That also means that the U.S. is going to help them build private prisons. The GEO group is going to be setting up in Mexico, in Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. These agreements.
Industry.
Right. You're going to get the surveillance. You're going to get the enforcement, the militarization with the equipment and the gun. All of that, it's like putting money into those things to be able to make it so. Mexico never used to deport people in other places.
She's saying that, you're saying that we're about to do this?
This is where this is headed. When you
Right.
talk to these other countries, this is where this is leading, right? Mexico, for example, used to not deport people. 2 or 3 weeks ago, Mexico deported 300 Indians from India. Now, they didn't used to deport people because they said they didn't have the money. Where did they get the money? And if they can deport people to India, yeah, they're going to deport the Haitians, the Jamaicans, because this is much closer than India. The Ghanaians, the Congolese, you know what I'm saying? Where did they get the money from all of a sudden? How are these other countries going to be safe? They're saying, oh, we're giving you aid, but what is that actually going to look like?
And then, Ms. Clark, you had gone through a list of items that you thought that DHS needed to address. Can you list those just quickly one more time? I happen to serve on the Homeland Security Committee and would want to raise this with our chairman, Mr. Thompson.
I would be happy to repeat my list. So I suggest calling on DHS to follow the clear guidance that was issued for MPP, specifically for the exclusionary grounds. So those are the vulnerable populations that have been enrolled into MPP despite their guidance. Excluding women from being placed on the morning docket, so that would be an effort to not have women and children be enrolled at that early time to present. Call on the Department of Justice Office of Legal Access to programs to allow Know Your Rights presentations or friend of court for the MPP dockets. And then lastly, continue monitoring the short-term detention facilities in which individuals and families are detained in the government's custody.
Very well. Madam Chair, I thank you very much, and I yield back.
Yes, you know what I thought we would do now is, just to conclude, is to ask the panelists, the witnesses, if they have any closing comments, and then I'll do the same of my colleagues.
So first of all, profound gratitude to all of you for being here, for holding this incredibly important hearing, and for conducting much-needed oversight over the lawlessness and the rights violations taking place at our border. I just want to close by emphasizing one thing, and that's that these illegal schemes cannot be fixed. There are not ways to make them better. They are profoundly unlawful policies to their core, and they need to be stopped. We are so grateful for champions like Congresswoman Lee for the work that you do to ensure that unlawful programs don't get funded and that conditions are put on assistance. But do just want to encourage Congress to please, members of Congress who are bothered by what's taking place at the border to stand strong, to work to defund these unlawful policies to the extent possible. Thank you.
Thank you. First of all, thank you very much for holding this hearing. I think it's incredibly important that that this is brought to public attention and continues to be brought to public attention. And so I very much would like to see that continue to happen as it goes forward. I totally agree that to the extent that Congress can defund these programs, they should. The programs shouldn't exist. They're illegal. We shouldn't be in this position, but we are. And so I'm not privy to how the sausage is made, but to the extent that you can undo it, I would very much appreciate that. I was also thinking about the title for this hearing, humanitarian aspects of the migratory crisis. And I think that alone sort of creates a false narrative as problematic, because migration isn't a crisis. Migration is a fact, and it's part of humanity, and it always has been. The crisis is the way that we're treating the migrants. And so I think to the extent that we can change that narrative and really think about how we are treating these individuals and the impact that our policies are having on individuals and on families who are going through extreme hardship to flee their homes and their families and violence and terrible situations that I heard every day, and then to turn our back on them. I think America is and has always held itself up to be a beacon of light and hope and of justice and of human rights. And as we continue to do these policies, we are one, signaling to the rest of the world that this is totally okay and that they can continue to take these actions. And two, we're turning our backs on ourselves and who we believe ourselves or would hold ourselves up to be as Americans. Thank you.
I too want to echo my colleagues' remarks and thank you for coming. Thank you for shedding light on this important issue. Going forward, I think that I would continue to ask the subcommittee to continue to talk about these issues, right? So this is November, and yet this policy began in January. I think that it hasn't been talked about, and now that there's over 55,000 individuals that have been returned to Mexico under MPP, it's starting to be talked about, but I don't think it's talked about as much as it should be. So the opportunity to share with your colleagues what you witnessed here today and, on your cross-border trip. I'd also ask that, continuing the oversight, I think, is a unique position that this subcommittee and your colleagues are also able to exercise. I shared that I do believe that the monitoring and continued investigation, specifically of the detention facilities, has at least allowed access for attorneys to go to the detention facilities to the extent possible that can be extended to other portions of the policies that are coming out every day. I'll also just say that not a day goes by that there's not another policy that's rolled out. So to really take a moment, see what that policy is, how it impacts our world, the individuals that are seeking asylum on our border, and to see specifically how you're able to monitor how DHS and other agencies are implementing them. Thank you.
If they haven't been talking about MPP, I thank you so very much for talking about Black migrants. I don't know if this has ever happened, a conversation that we get to be at the table to talk about what is happening with Black migrants at the border in this high-level way. So really appreciating that. Just ask that you continue to lift up Black migrants, to continue to think about ways. We're already seeing all these minds going about different ways that Black migrants can be highlighted in this conversation about what we can do for people to be free. The Black migrants, 3,500 of them, that formed their own assembly, elected their own representatives of 15 countries in Tapachula, they only wanted one thing. They wrote a 2-page demand letter, had a 45-minute press conference. One thing they wanted: to be able to come to the United States and have their families be safe. That was it. That was it. And anything that you can do to help to make that happen will be greatly appreciated.
Thank you. Representative Vargas?
Well, thank you very much, Madam Chair, for holding this hearing. To say that we did have the opportunity to bring the speaker here, and the speaker has come also to the detention facility. And she was able to speak to someone from Cameroon. And I think that one of the things that's very, very important, I think we saw that today in Tijuana, is that you do have a very vulnerable population, doesn't speak the language, that is under particular threat. People from Africa, people from Latin America, who are Black, get discriminated against in a way that's horrible in Mexico. The whole queuing system is illegal, in my opinion, but in particular, these vulnerable populations, LGBTQ populations, shouldn't have to be in this queue. They should be able to present themselves at the border and say, we're asking for asylum. And they should immediately be able to enter the United States and go through the process. And even though this administration has done everything, in my opinion, that's illegal and immoral, this is something I think we can do to push back with the issue of funding and say this is a policy that has to be changed. In particular, again, vulnerable populations don't speak Spanish, and LGBT community, because once again, they get discriminated against in Mexico. You heard today, we heard the people who explained us they were beaten, they were mistreated, they were treated differently, and we should do something about that. So again, I thank you very, very much. I hope this isn't the last time. I know it won't be. And we have to make progress here. And again, it's been a dehumanizing process here. The only humanizing thing I've saw recently was that finally a jury in Tucson, Arizona, sure Mr. Warren wasn't in prison for just basic, decent human decency.
Why don't you talk, for giving water?
Yeah, okay, well,
Don't know.
so here in San Diego, in fact, it's interesting, here, Duncan Hunter's father, Duncan Hunter, not Duncan Hunter Jr., his brother, John Hunter, started putting water out in the desert. It was called Water Station. He's actually done this for about 20 years. We used to go out and put it, I was one of the first people that used to join him. In fact, we used to stay at the Lazy Lizard afterwards, which was a bar, and someone had granted him,
Too much information.
someone had granted him a trailer. But anyway, we would put water out in the desert, and they were going to arrest us because we didn't have permits from the Bureau of Land Management. Because his brother, Duncan Hunter Sr., was a Congress member, they allowed us then ultimately to get these permits. So then it became legal, if you will. Well, the same thing was going on in Tucson, and they arrested a young man, and 36 years old, I believe, and they were going to put him in prison for simply giving water and food to migrants that were lost in the desert and probably would have died. They tried him once, and the jury came back with no decision. Hung jury. They came back on a second. They tried him again for, again, basic human dignity and basic human kindness. And this time a unanimous jury said he was not guilty. And that's about the last humanity we've seen here on the border. Thank God for that jury.
Representative Lee? I'm crazy, so what?
You asked for it, so I gave you about the least. No, talking about.
Okay, once again, I'd just like to thank our chair. Actually, the title of her subcommittee is Subcommittee on Africa, Global Health, Global Human Rights, and International Organizations. And I say that because she has very broad jurisdiction. And this is historic, really, quite frankly. And so it's because our chairwoman and also chair of the Black Caucus has decided to make this a priority. So thank you very much, Chairwoman Bass. Thank you. And I want to once again say thank you to our audience and also to the panelists. You've been very brave, you've been very focused, and we've learned a lot, and you definitely have given us a lot of what we need to go back to fight the good fight in Washington, D.C., and thank you for what you do each and every day. I think it's important also that the press has covered some of this hearing and our work today, because I don't think the taxpayers, U.S. taxpayers, know they're funding these violations of human rights. And people need to know that. They need to understand what their government is doing in their name to black migrants. And so here in Mexico, we all have seen how black migrants are really being treated not like human beings at all. They're being dehumanized, and this is un-American, quite frankly, and we're going to have to do something about it in a way that hasn't been done before. We all are on key committees that have a lot of leverage. Again, we understand what we're dealing with in this administration, but we're up for the fight, as we've always been. And where there's a will, there's a way. But for the sake of humanity and for the sake of those of us who are people of faith, we are our brothers and sisters' keeper, and we want to do unto others as they would have them do unto us. So thank you again very much. We really appreciate your being here.
Representative Davis?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for allowing me to be on the panel, because I'm not on the specific committee, and to be quite honest, I was kind of covering for my roommate, who is. But I'm so glad that I had this opportunity to be here. I really appreciate it. You know, one of the things that I think we all value so dear is the rule of law in our country. And thank God we have that, because that is making a difference. It made a difference here in San Diego when we had a judge who came forward and said, no, this is not what we do. We do not separate children from their parents. But at the same time, what I see is that we have some bad, horrible policies that are being implemented, and it's a kind of, I would call it almost a domino injustice. One act follows another, and they all compound to be something that we really, we can't see in this country. And so I don't like the feeling of reading in history books and thinking, how did this happen? Right. And then being in a situation today where we have to ask the same question. So thank you for being here. I want to be able to proudly say this is who we are. And today, I think for a lot of us, we don't feel that way. Thank you.
That's for sure. Representative Clark?
Madam Chair, let me thank you once again. I'm a New Yorker. I'm from Brooklyn, New York, and to be in San Diego for the very first time, to travel to Tijuana for the very first time, Mexico, really has left an impression on me. I know that so many of you have come here today because you are concerned about the same things that we're concerned about as members of this committee, and wanted to get more information about. But I live in a town where we have a Statue of Liberty that sits in our harbor that was a portal for so many immigrants to come to this nation, many fleeing persecution. And I'm a second-generation American. My parents were born on the beautiful island nation of Jamaica. And so I take this personally because I take America personally. I know that this is a nation that so many have come, have built. Some were forced into labor and have never been really recognized and humanized in the way that they ought to have. But there have been waves and waves of immigrants to this country. And again, we've always sort of seen ourselves as that nation that welcomes the stranger, particularly those who found themselves in harm's way. And to be here today, to cross over into Tijuana and see people and see myself in those people was painful, but at the same time empowering. To listen to each and every one of you in your testimony with your expertise and your talent and your giving of yourselves for this very vulnerable population. You could be doing a whole lot of other things with your talent, but you're here with us today. We're grateful to each and every one of you. We're grateful to the audience who have come to witness this work that we're doing. And I just wanted to say that I'm reared up, I'm pumped up, I'm geared up, and I'm ready to get back to D.C. and get in somebody's face. With that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
That would be Brooklyn speaking. Well, just to wrap up, I was looking at this article and I was thinking of you, Mr. Stevens, because this is an article that says a top U.S. immigration official threatened to fire employees for leaking information to the media. So your colleagues that stayed in the system are not allowed to speak and to tell what's going on. And I think probably one of the reasons is because there are people, I believe, who are ashamed of this and know that this is not right. You know, the whole world is experiencing right now the massive movements of people that's happening all over the world. And it's happening for different reasons. And what we have seen, one of the untold stories of the African continent, is that you have people leaving countries. I mean, I've been to Uganda, where in Uganda, they basically don't recognize their border. They have over 1 million refugees that are there. And they feel like those boundaries boundaries weren't really important to begin with. I'm not suggesting that's what we do here. I'm just saying that there are other countries in the world. You could look at Jordan, the country of Jordan, where they have welcomed refugees. You could look at our country a few years ago, and we welcomed refugees. Well, one of the things that's happening with the migration out of Africa, because Europe has essentially taken the direction of where we are in terms of wanting to shut off migration, they basically, in some European countries, I think Italy is one, if you rescue somebody in a boat, you can get arrested and fined, which means that they can drown. And so if people are not able to escape their conditions via the sea, then you also have increased migration here. And, you know, we named this a humanitarian crisis. The reason we called this hearing this way is because, in our opinion, this has been addressed as a law enforcement problem. And we don't feel it is a law enforcement problem. We do feel it's a humanitarian crisis. And the reason why there's so many movements of people throughout the world is, one, climate change. Climate change is causing massive movements of people. When you have drought, people can't eat. And then the other reason is conflict. So you have conflicts around the world. And the ironic thing about our continent is that some of the conflicts that are happening, like whenever I hear talk about El Salvador and Mara Salvatrucha, well, I'm from Los Angeles. MS-13 started in my city. We exported this problem to El Salvador. Some of our very policies are the reasons why the Central American countries are having problems and people are leaving. So the very thing that we need to do, because I don't think most people want to take journeys like that. I think some of my colleagues might think they go on Southwest Airlines and fly to Tijuana and don't really understand the incredible journey that people take. People don't willingly do that. They do that out of absolute desperation. And so it would make sense to me that the way we would address this problem is to address the reason why they're leaving their countries to begin with. So instead of cutting foreign aid or threatening countries around their foreign aid, if you don't adopt our immigration policies and keep these people, then we're going to cut your foreign aid. Instead of that, what we should do in our country is to come together with these countries and address the root causes as to why people are leaving. And, you know, and I said it before and I'll say it everywhere I go, the policies of state-sponsored child abuse, which is what it is to me when you separate children. I've been to the border in Texas at McAllen, and I watched the reunification of families where they had been separated, and I saw small children who were just kind of in shock when they saw their mother for the first time in months. They didn't know what to do. They didn't know how to respond. One of the issues I work on is child welfare, and I know that trauma that child went through is lifelong. And I happen to believe that our country should pay damages to these families, that we should pay for the reunification, and we should pay for damages for what we have done. And so to see the plight of the Black migrants today, the fact that they have been invisible, that's one of the things that is so important. People don't even realize that they're there, and we certainly need to lift their plight. Well, it's not surprising that we would have policies that would really exclude them, because this whole thing that you were trying to explain to me, that you said is illegal, this metering thing, is to how people get in line for asylum. I don't know how you do that if you can't speak to anyone. But I do know that this administration refers to these people's countries as shithole countries. If that's what you think about the countries where they come from, then obviously you don't want these people coming in your country. But one thing that I'm proud of in Congress is that, you know, there have been many times where the administration has tried to divide us amongst members of Congress. So we're going to allow DACA recipients to remain in the country, but we're going to eliminate diversity visas. Diversity visas is the primary vehicle in which Africans and Asians come into the United States. But you should know that the members of Congress have stood strong. We've stood strong, we've stood together. We do not allow the administration or anyone else to divide us, and that we stand for comprehensive immigration reform. Well, I have to say, Ms. Gyamfi, you've scared me by talking about private prisons and detention centers. I realize that we have private prisons in this country, but the idea that these would be exported to other countries is really chilling, because when the story is finally told, one of the real deals behind this whole thing we're going through around immigration, there's a whole lot of people making millions and millions of dollars off of the incredible suffering of people. The idea that the president's former chief of staff is now on the board of one of the private prison companies that is responsible for the detention of children somehow, to me, says corruption. But I have to say, though, that today has been a very powerful day. I'm just so appreciative to my colleague and friend. We've worked together for many years, Representative Vargas. We need to give him a round of applause. I appreciate Representative Davis, who is going to be leaving us at the end of next year, as she announced her retirement from Congress, and she has given such incredible service and representing this area here in Southern California, and we need to give her a round of applause. My two colleagues who have traveled, Barbara Lee, we always say in Congress, Barbara Lee speaks for me. Coming from Oakland, California, you need to know she is one of the highest-ranking leaders within the House of Representatives. She serves on the Steering and Policy Committee. She co-chairs that, and has always been a fighter for justice. And when we talked about this trip, she signed up immediately. And as a matter of fact, this summer we were in Cameroon because we've gone to the countries of origin to see what is going on, what is the conflict, why are people leaving, and we're going to continue to do that. And I know that after hearing about the detention centers, that's going to be our next trip. But please give my colleague, Representative Lee. And the one who traveled the furthest from Brooklyn, not only traveled from Brooklyn and is going to go home on a red eye tonight, but yesterday was her birthday. And she took the time to do this on her birthday. She also is the vice chair of one of the most powerful committees in the House, the Committee on Energy and Commerce. And I do want to give a shout out to the staff of Representative Vargas and my staff. My entire staff from Los Angeles came down here yesterday, and our two staffs have worked together really well. In addition to my staff from Washington, D.C., the woman who's sitting behind me, who's responsible for it all, Dr. Yarwood, is the staff director for the Africa Subcommittee, and the other staff that are here that came from Washington, D.C. and Los Angeles. Please give out a wave, as well as Representative Clark's staff. So, we also have a staff from Senator Harris. There you go. From Senator Kamala and Representative Susan Wiles, who is the vice chair of the subcommittee, is here representing, and Representative Clark's staff is here. So all came from all around the country. Senator Feinstein has a staff member here? Oh, thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you very much. So with this, let me just say that we're not going to stop. We're not going to stop until this page in our history is turned and is never, ever visited again. We're adjourned.